This video was produced by
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Virginia State Wind Symposium and welcome to the Wind 101 workshop. It's our intention in this workshop to just kind of give a brief and general introduction to the wind industry, wind economics, wind technology, and just basically go through a nice, well-rounded early understanding of wind energy. Our first part of the workshop is going to be an overview of the wind energy industry, presented by Dr. Jonathan Miles. Thank you.
That's entirely unnecessary, but thank you. And thank you, Kenny, for that introduction. Just briefly, I think you all are here probably for largely the same reason, and that is that you're interested in wind for one reason or another, and you just want to understand the various facets of wind energy and the wind industry better than you already do. I hope that's your purpose for being here, and so our goal as we constructed the agenda for this workshop, which is the longest of the 4 workshops this morning, is to expose you to the different areas that we think would be most relevant and important to a wind generalist. That is, no one who maybe aspires to work in the field, at least immediately, but at least to understand the basics of the industry and how it is served and the technologies and so on. So the first talk we had originally intended to be presented by Stephen Miner. He couldn't be here this early. He's with the American Wind Energy Association, but will be here this afternoon to serve on a panel as well. So if there is something in this talk that particularly inspires you, I may direct you to Mr. Miner if, in fact, he has some time before or after his panel later in the day. And I'll be followed by Mitch King, who Mitch King is going to get into the economics of wind in much more detail than I will here. And then later on, Kenny and others will speak to you about some of the more technical elements associated with wind energy. And I'm not accustomed to holding a mic like this, so if I spontaneously break into song, just bear with me. I'll get back on track soon enough. That would be very helpful if you wouldn't mind. So Mr. Miner's presentation is really just the basic stock presentation that he and others at AWEA give. Quick little bit of background. AWEA, I mentioned AWEA, I'll refer to AWEA, stands for the American Wind Energy Association. They are the national trade organization for the wind industry. They are responsible for a lot of the lobbying that is done to Congress. They are responsible for serving industry's needs. They have a really excellent website at awea.org, and there are a lot of resources available there for anyone who wishes to access the kind of information that I'll provide here and other information as well. Go ahead, Kenny. So let me start off by just introducing to you the wind industry. The industry installed 5,000 megawatts in the U.S. in 2010. These statistics seem a little bit dated. This is not as up to date as we would have liked to present, but the 2011 numbers are a little bit more inaccessible, and I think what you'd find at the AWEA website, if the 2011 numbers aren't available right now, they will be soon. What tends to happen is that AWEA gets its numbers from the Department of Energy and the various national laboratories that it supports, in particular the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and updates these figures as these reports become available. So the total U.S. wind installations stand at 40,000 megawatts. Now that sounds like a lot of power generating capacity, but to put that in perspective, a single large fossil fuel fired electricity generator is responsible for on the order of 1,000 megawatts. So 40,000 doesn't sound like so much when you consider all the fossil fuel generating capacity and nuclear generating capacity that we have here in the U.S. And that figure actually represents more on the order of a couple % of our overall electricity generating capacity in the U.S. And U.S. wind installations represent over 21% of global wind capacity. So we did overtake European countries several years ago in terms of overall installed capacity. We've since been overtaken in Asia. But nonetheless, we've seen significant increases in installed capacity over the last several years for a number of reasons that I'll get into. So new wind capacity represented about a quarter of all new capacity installed in 2010. So it's comparable. It's at the top as compared to other generating capacities from other sources, as indicated. I hope you all can see the screens reasonably well. I dimmed the front lights here. These projectors aren't the best, but they serve the purpose fairly well. And wind remained the second largest source of new installed capacity, second to natural gas. Just a few years ago, wind was number one for a couple of years. But with the significant reductions in natural gas prices, we've seen that sector pick up quite a bit of steam more recently. And all renewable capacity combined represented nearly a third of new capacity. So if you consider solar, and the prices for solar electricity have come down significantly as well, wind still is the more dominant generating source among renewables if you consider that against solar, consider that against biomass, and so on. What we saw, just getting off track a little bit, in the 1980s and 1990s leading up to about 2000, over that 20-year period, the cost for generating electricity with wind reduced by about a factor of 10. And so wind changed from 1980 to being somewhat of a boutique generating source that really still was not ready for prime time, just in terms of its ability to compete with traditional electricity generating sources, to 2000, where it was ready for prime time. At that point, you could generate electricity with wind on the order of 7-8 cents per kilowatt hour, which is close to competitive with traditional generating sources. Go ahead. So wind installed over 35% of all new generating capacity between 2007 and 2010, with nearly 29,000 megawatts added. So you can see during that period of time in the 2000s, wind really started to take off. Okay, Kenny? Wind now provides over 2% of U.S. electricity. It reached 1% in the 2000s. Within a few years, made it to 2%. Now we're over 2%. And there is a national, I don't know if I use the word goal, but there was a report released by the Department of Energy in 2008 that I'll talk about in a little bit, that sort of lays the groundwork, sees a scenario where we could reach 20% by 2030. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So electricity from wind power capacity in the U.S. will supply the equivalent of over 10 million American homes and is comparable to the generating capacity of nearly 10 nuclear power plants. But there are some overarching benefits associated with wind, which suggests that, at least for certain cases, it's a better alternative to the other sources of electricity. 38 states now have utility-scale wind installations. I'm sorry and sad to say that Virginia is not one of them. We're on the cusp. We've been on the cusp. We have the appropriate attributes here. Good wind resources, not great, but good, certainly good enough, to the point where we've attracted significant interest from developers, major developers, over the last dozen years. We've had policy advances. These will be discussed and addressed during the panels today and tomorrow. And we've had strong support from our government, from starting with the Warner administration through the Kane administration and the McDonnell administration as well. Although emphasis has been shifting for Virginia more toward the offshore opportunity. Yes?
Well, like, for example, West Virginia, 431 installations. Does that mean 431 wind turbines?
No. No, that's megawatts, installed capacity. Now, 14 states have more than 1,000 megawatts installed, and Texas has more than 10,000. Texas has enormous wind resources. You'll see a wind resource map up here shortly. But we're behind the curve in Virginia. We were recognized over 10 years ago by the Department of Energy as its Wind Powering America program was initiated as a stuck state or a high priority state, depending upon whether you want to look at it from a more negative or positive perspective. Stuck in the sense that we just couldn't get that first wind farm installed. And we're still trying to get that first wind farm installed. But a high priority state in the sense that DOE recognized that Virginia had good resources, was advancing more supportive policies, has created since that time regulatory mechanisms that would be favorable toward wind, and felt that we had the infrastructure in place to advance wind. Wind power capacity in the interconnection queue. So if you look down in the left-hand side here, there are 8 different regions, transmission regions, if you will, in the U.S. The third one down, the Mid-Atlantic and areas to our north and to our west, outside of what we might classify as the Mid-Atlantic, are covered by the PJM region. And PJM stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, but it includes many more states beyond that, and most of Virginia. So these are regions, transmission regions that are managed by a sole source, and these regions are, will serve a number of purposes, but probably the most important one, the ability within that region to carefully coordinate generation and transmission and make sure that lines are balanced and not overtaxed and so on and so forth. And you can see within our region we have substantial wind capacity already installed. And notice there are already 275,000 megawatts of wind projects in the interconnection queues. That is, companies have, shall we say, reserved their slot to add more wind capacity. 275,000, that's a lot more than the 40,000 already installed. And there's no guarantee, of course, that any particular fraction of that number will ultimately get installed. But it demonstrates that there's interest. It's not just a matter of hop online or make a phone call, okay, I've got my slot in the queue now. It costs money, it costs resources to get that slot in the queue. Go ahead, Kenny. U.S. top 20 wind power capacity owners are listed here. And those top 20 owners in the U.S. Account for about half of 2010 installations. There are a number of major players in this industry, and then there are a whole lot of minor players. There are different kinds of projects. The most common one is the very traditional project where a experienced developer comes and develops a project on behalf of a company that may wish to develop and own a project, or may develop a project which gets sold. Utilities have been a major player. Florida Power and Light is one of the major utilities that has driven and promoted and supported wind development. Some of the utilities have sold their project. Now there's been a trend toward holding on to these projects. Among other reasons, when you realize that how much money and how many assets, how many resources go into developing these assets. It costs a lot of money to permit a project and to do a siting assessment. And then to hand over this project, which even after its lifetime can be repowered with new technologies, you realize there's probably a business interest in holding on to these assets over the long haul. And the nice thing about wind, as compared to other technologies, among other things, there's no fuel costs. And that means there's no exposure to the volatility in fuel prices or fuel availability as well. And there isn't ever any prospect of being prone to carbon taxes or other regulatory issues or impacts that would be associated with emissions. Once the project is built, and granted, wind projects require significant capital investment up front, the electricity is, I put this in very bold-faced quotes, free. to the extent that the fuel is free. Sure, there's operating and maintenance costs, but those are fairly low compared to the installed costs up front. And there are no emissions. There's no fuel costs. So you generate the electricity when the wind is available. And when the wind is available, the electricity is essentially free. Again, aside from the operating and maintenance costs that have to be built into the financing and operations. Go on. Wind turbine manufacturers share of the 2010 U.S. wind power installations breakdown. So there are major, shall we say, primary manufacturers who supply turbines, who supply all the other major components. But notice the ones on the top here. GE Energy supply wind turbines, Siemens, Gamesa, Mitsubishi, Suzlon, Vestas, Acciona, Clipper, et cetera, et cetera. All these companies that you see here provide equipment. Some of them also engage in development and other activities related to the wind industry and wind development. Go on, Kenny. And here you see how the manufacturing activities associated with wind are distributed. You'll notice here that there are over 400 facilities manufacturing for the wind industry. General Electric is one of the few American manufacturers. Many of those others that you saw, Gamesa, Acciona, Alstom, who is represented here, and in fact, a gentleman from Alstom in the U.S., based in Richmond, is going to give our keynote this afternoon. These are European companies that have identified opportunities for business development expansion in the U.S. Now, the Southeast is the region of the U.S. that has the least strong wind resources. But given its business climate, its lower costs for labor resources, and other attributes, it's been an attractor for the wind industry. And Virginia is starting to pick up as well. As the offshore opportunities become more apparent, and you consider our ports and our resources in the water and our location midway along the eastern seaboard, you've seen more interest in development here. Gamesa's been here. They're still here, although they have put their project or their intentions to test their new offshore wind turbines off the eastern shore on hold for now. Alstom is here and seems intent on maintaining its presence and supporting development in Virginia. So I think we're going to see manufacturing take off, or at least increase. But one of the challenges in the U.S., not just in this state, but in the U.S., has been a bit of uncertainty in terms of what the government's position is and how strongly they're going to support wind and other renewables. Did you have a question, Michael?
Yeah. I see locations in Roanoke, Charlotte, Harrisburg, and West Virginia, Maryland. Any of those companies, can you name which one of those companies are?
I'll give you an example. General Electric has a plant in Salem, Virginia. They manufacture the electronics and controls for their 1.5 megawatt machines in Salem. There are other companies in the region as well that produce components that go into gearboxes. We don't have in Virginia, and I don't believe in the region, any manufacturing of the complete systems here, but some of the components are manufactured in and around Virginia. Excellent. So overall, the U.S. wind industry supported 75,000 direct and indirect jobs in 2010. And you can see from the legend at the top of this figure here how that breaks down. Next slide. Of the 75,000 jobs across the wind industry, Texas ranked #1 for total jobs, followed by Illinois and Colorado. Vestas has a large presence in Colorado. Some of the other companies, including Siemens, do as well, and other companies. Alstom has done some of its testing and manufacturing in Texas. This administration and previous administrations have worked pretty hard to try to attract more interest in Virginia. They've landed a presence in Virginia with Alstom and Gamesa, which both stand to be two of the major players, particularly in offshore wind. As it takes off, I should note here, there is no offshore development anywhere in the U.S. right now. But as far as the Department of Energy is concerned, the eastern seaboard, particularly the mid-Atlantic, because of our shallow waters that extend out quite a ways, and our good wind resources stand to probably be the first area that is commercially developed. The Great Lakes look good as well. I'd say the Gulf Coast may be farther off because the wind resources aren't as good, averaged over time, and they're prone to, of course, extreme events. And the Northwest, the West Coast, but particularly the North Coast, where there are very good winds, also has very deep water. And deep water to the extent that it is not as competitive right now and economically viable as we'd see here in the mid-Atlantic. So you've seen a lot of activities off the coasts of Massachusetts, of course. Everybody knows about the Cape Wind Project, but there's been a lot of activity off the coast of Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia. Virginia and Maryland have the only offshore space so far that has been, shall we say, pre-approved through activities supported by the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior. As far as the U.S. wind potential, there's our wind resource map. That is the second generation of these resource maps that are produced through a partnership between AWS True Wind, now known as AWS True Power, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. The first versions or generations of these maps were released in the early 2000s, in many cases with support from the states. Our Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy supported the first version. This is the national map for Virginia and all the other states. And what you note here, if you look at the legend and the color coordination with average wind speeds, is sure enough, in the middle of the country, that's where you have the strongest winds. You might remember there was a gentleman with modest wealth by the name of T. Boone Pickens a few years ago, as gas prices were spiking, who was all over wind. But by golly, we need to develop wind from Texas all the way on up into the Dakotas, and Nebraska and Kansas. There are tremendous wind resources in the middle of the country. But what's the challenge? Can you think of one challenge in particular about putting all your eggs in that basket, in the bread basket, putting all the wind turbines in the middle of the country like that? It's not where all the people are. Right. That's one of the big challenges with that idea. And as gas prices came back down, Mr. Pickens got a little less excited about his earlier ideas, and in fact has even sold off some of the inventory that he picked up at the time. But right, transmission, our transmission system in the U.S. is old, and it's antiquated, and it wasn't designed to bring lots of intermittent generated power from the middle of the country to the load centers. You have Chicago not too far from there and other large cities, but the major load centers are on the east and the west coast. That's one of the reasons why, among others, that offshore looks so attractive, because it's close to or closer to the load centers. I mentioned the 20% wind by 2030 report. Now, ironically, maybe to some who followed the second Bush administration, this report was instigated by comments made by George W. Bush during a visit to NREL a couple of years before 2008. He commented while he was there, by golly, we could, in fact, have such and such a percent of wind by such and such a year. I don't remember what the numbers were. But DOE heard that, and OEA heard that, and others heard that and said, well, you know what, the president said it, we ought to determine whether this is feasible. And they went off, over 100 experts in the field, and studied the wind resources and studied the transmission infrastructure and studied policies and came back and said, you know what, it wouldn't take a Herculean or an Apollo-like effort to get to 20% wind by 2030. Now, if you think about it, that's a lot. If at that point we hadn't even reached 2%. To get to 20% just over 20 years later, that sounds like a lot. But what they determined was, with a continuation of improvements in technologies and better, more consistent policies in this field, it wasn't unreasonable, this notion of getting there to 20% electricity by 2030. That's still less as a percent of than some countries in Europe. And it also analyzed and identified specific barriers that would make it difficult to get to 20% by 2030 that had to be considered and addressed in order for that scenario to be possible. It would require an installation rate of 16 gigawatts per year after 2018. Notice this is blue, so this shows the installed capacity as it ramps up, sort of levels off in terms of rate, and then starts to taper off a little bit. And this bifurcation here where you start to see green, that suggests that offshore wind begins to contribute to the overall addition of installed capacity. So offshore becomes a player in about 2014. That was, the good news here is that in the first few years after this report was released, these goals, if you want to call it that, were exceeded. The notion of offshore becoming a player in 2014, 2015, probably a little bit aggressive and a little bit unrealistic. I think at this point most people agree that we're going to see offshore wind really become a contributor later in this decade. The Department of Energy did release a request for proposals or a funding opportunity announcement in their parlance earlier this year. And proposals were submitted by the end of May of this year. And there is a Virginia proposal. I don't know if it'll be funded, and I'm not at liberty to discuss it. I'm not named in it, but it is a pretty exciting opportunity if it's funded. But that's one of a lot of proposals that DOE will consider, and they'll probably fund about a half a dozen. That could result in about $180 million of federal funding supporting initial projects intended primarily to demonstrate and test new technologies. But it's a starting point. In the meantime, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, all our major federal agencies that have an interest in offshore have been cooperating and communicating very, very effectively. And there was a call for interest by the Department of Interior, issued some months ago that generated 8 responses for the Virginia offshore wind energy area alone. So I think you're going to see development, but I think it's still some years off, hopefully by the end of the decade. Michael?
Yeah, the question is, 180 million, is that the total for all DOE, or is that for?
That's DOE's contribution. And these projects would involve and would require matching funding as well. So
Would that be for Virginia or for?
it'd be for all nationwide, all projects. So there's your 20% wind growth path. Go ahead. And in this scenario, by 2030, you'd see all but only 4 states, Connecticut, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, presenting installed wind capacity, where the shade of green is related to the magnitude of installed capacity in a given state. So you can see Virginia wouldn't be the strongest state, would be exceeded by Texas, Oklahoma, even North Carolina, but would be a significant player in that scenario. And these turbines along the East Coast and the Gulf and the Great Lakes and the West do imply that all of our offshore areas would be contributing as well. And again, this is a scenario that is not an unreasonable one or an excessive one, but does imply that there are transmission upgrades, that there are policies, advanced policies put into place, more consistent policies, that there are technology improvements that bring costs down, and so on. One of the things we hear from the Department of Energy loud and clear, and it seems to be the administration's position as well, we are not going to use the kinds of aggressive policies or aggressive incentives that we've seen in Europe to drive offshore wind development in the U.S. We're going to rely on bringing the costs down so that they can compete in the free market at least reasonably well, maybe with some additional incentives to help drive this. But we're going to bring the cost down to 13 cents per kilowatt hour. Then we're going to bring offshore wind down to 10 cents. So it's in the ballpark. Ma'am? Yeah, good question. Why Connecticut? Why is Connecticut singled out? And the easy answer, I don't have the detailed answer, the easy answer is that this scenario is based upon many assumptions, some of which may or may not ultimately be reasonable or true. But if you were to tinker with the assumptions, you'd probably see other states go white and some other states become green. Connecticut, frankly, doesn't have a lot of space. I mean, there are projects, potential projects, but they're probably of a smaller variety. I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to go through these last slides fairly quickly. But I just want to point out that the 20% by 2030 report identifies a number of benefits, among them CO2 reductions. Flattens electricity industry CO2 emissions. It expands diversity in how we generate electricity in the U.S. The notion of this report, and again, keep in mind that this was released in 2008 when natural gas prices were high. And the notion was that this would offset natural gas generated electricity, take some of the pressure off those prices, and reduce the price subsequently for natural gas, which would be to the benefit of other industries that depend upon natural gas as a driver. So here you see it, the natural gas contributions, even the coal contributions, start to become reduced. Some of the older coal plants could go offline. Nuclear would probably stay about the same. Hydro would stay about the same, but the wind contribution would go up significantly. I'm going to go very quickly through these last slides. Market drivers. Well, among other drivers in the U.S. we've had for years is what's known as the production and then the investment tax credit. And Mitch just arrived. He's going to take on the second session. He's probably going to talk a little bit about the connection between these. You know, we talk about wind as an intermittent power generating source. We should note that there's been a fair bit of intermittency with respect to the production tax credits that have helped to incentivize wind, but has done so in cycles. And there's a clear connection between these, the cycling of these federal tax credits and the boom and bust cycle you see in terms of the deployment of new technologies and increases in installed capacity as well. We're going through one of the downsides right now. The current version of the production and investment tax credits is set to expire at the end of this year, which means that months ago, if not a year ago, companies started to back off and lay off and put projects that had been in development on ice unless they were very confident they could be built and generating electricity by the end of this year. So there needs to be, and I think AWEA would be the first organization to say this, there needs to be a better solution to this cycling on and off of these tax credits. And I've even heard the administration suggest in the last few months, maybe we ought to just do without them or consider sunsetting these tax credits after they're renewed the next time. Because there's some arguments to be made that maybe they do more damage than benefit to the industry by this ramp up, ramp down, and therefore the inability to attract manufacturing, which of course is very costly to set up. Okay? Some of the other demand drivers are state renewable portfolio standards. Virginia has one, sort of, right, Mitch? Power demand. Nobody argues the point that demand is going up everywhere and will continue to do so, despite our best efforts or some of our efforts at conservation and higher efficiency. Our retirement of older plants. There's controversy going on right now in certain parts of the country about relicensing old nuclear power plants, and of course older coal plants are subject to newer regulations that may or may not allow them to continue to run and be economically viable. Wind on land right now within good wind resources are highly competitive with other sources. Maybe not as cheap to run and build as natural gas plants given the current prices, but certainly more cost effective than new coal power plants and certainly more cost effective than nuclear. And there's an interest in diversity of power sources. I showed you the wind resource map, and I talked a little bit about the T. Boone Pickens plan to develop all in the middle of the country. But keep in mind, the weather flows from west to east. And if you put all your power generating capacity in one region, then you're not spreading out the intermittency of the wind power generating capacity in the country. So we want to diversify in terms of source, in terms of location, and of course there needs to be the transmission upgrades to complement that as well. I mentioned the production tax credit. The prospects for extension when these slides were written were pretty good. There's been several failed attempts in the last 6 months to a year to try to get an extension of the production tax credit onto a bill. And OEA is going to keep trying. And then, yeah, there are other drivers as well. Go on. So I think at this point what we're looking at is the need for other policy drivers, perhaps other structures, other mechanisms to perhaps put wind on a level playing field. All the energy sectors, all the different electricity generating sources have or benefit from federal assistance or incentives or credits or structures of some sort. Mitch, who's just arrived, will talk more about this, I'm sure. It's hard to compete with other countries that have been more consistent with their policies, that have been more aggressive in terms of supporting renewables than we have here in the U.S. What's gone on with solar, which I don't have time to get into, has been a good indication of that, and how Asian countries in particular have been very effective and successful in advancing their solar industries, and we've not here in the U.S. for a number of reasons, but among them policies that are and incentives that are not as attractive here in the U.S. Going on here. And then, as I've been saying right along here, we just haven't had what's defined here as the hard renewable commitments in this country as you've seen in other countries. The long-term policy outlook, well, OEA is there for a reason, to support this industry, to drive this industry, to assist and advance the industry. They always have an optimistic outlook. They work very hard on behalf of their membership to try to create opportunities and reduce barriers for this industry. And I do want to mention the second to last bullet, often overlooked, but water is an important factor as well. I mentioned no fuel costs, no fuel except the wind, no emissions. But one thing to consider, all of the fossil and nuclear-driven electricity generation consumes water at a rate comparable to the agriculture industry in this country. And in some regions in particular, that water consumption is critical and significant. So that is another benefit to this particular technology. I won't even talk about the transmission plan right now, but I would like to just wrap it up. I'm a little bit behind, but I could take a couple of questions. If you go to the next slide, Kenny, it should have my contact information and Stephen's as well. Just keep clicking. There we go. One more. So I'm happy to take questions, a couple questions right now, but I don't want to set Mitch back. And take other questions by email, by call, whatever you like. But let me give you guys a couple of minutes here if you've got any right now, or if you'd like any clarification on any of what I've presented. Or if I put you to sleep. Hope not. Okay, well, thank you. I hope that introduction serves you well. I want to introduce Mitch King. Mitch has been involved in helping to advance wind here in Virginia for probably longer than I have. He's based in Charlottesville. He's a very creative thinker, and will hopefully give you the opportunity to understand a little bit better the economics associated with wind and the wind industry. And thank you very much for your time and your attention, and hope you enjoy the symposium.
My name is Mitch King. As John mentioned at the end of the last presentation, I'm the president of a company called Old Mill Power Company. I'm located in Albemarle County, just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. And biggest claim to fame I have is I formed the company in 1996 to sell renewable electricity at retail in Virginia in competition with the local utilities at a time when the General Assembly and the utilities thought they wanted to switch from monopoly regulation of utilities to, or I should say regulated monopoly utilities, to competitive electric service. Some of you may know that those plans never came to fruition. We went through about an 8-year transition period and then abandoned the whole idea in 2007. So in the meantime, my company switched from wanting to sell renewable electricity at retail in Virginia to selling renewable energy certificates, which is a major source of revenue for many renewable energy projects, including wind projects. So I think those are my biggest claims to qualifications to talk about this subject today. And then I will also, I think, begin with a caveat, which is that I am the stand-in for this presentation, so adjust your expectations accordingly. But the biggest qualification I have, other than what I just stated, was the fact that I live nearby, relatively speaking. And when Deborah Jacobson, who was scheduled to speak to you this morning, called me yesterday and said, I will not be able to make the morning session, would you please stand in for me? I agreed. I'm actually on my way to Northeast Pennsylvania, where I'm working on a vacation/retirement home, but also to join family members there to go on our annual beach vacation. So I will not be staying beyond this presentation. The original slides that you're going to see were prepared by Mark Bollinger of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. They are very detailed, and I'm sure if Mark were here, he could address each slide in a lot more detail than I can. Nevertheless, as I said, I have seen these once before at the American Wind Energy Association conference in Atlanta about 2 weeks ago. And it was a very informative presentation. I will not do it justice, but nevertheless, between what's on the slides and the questions you may ask during the presentation, I will hopefully impart some new information to you that you might not have been aware of before. And with respect to questions, let me suggest that because these are very complicated slides and I didn't prepare them, if you have a question, it's probably best to bring it up while the slide is on the screen. Otherwise, it'll be a little tricky for us to go back and see what were you talking about to get to that point. This is actually an excerpt from a document that the Department of Energy prepares annually through Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and it's called the 2001 Wind Technologies Market Report. It is publicly available. Of course, because 2012 is ongoing, the current report will focus on 2011, and the scope primarily includes utility-scale wind projects. Let me ask a question while I'm here for a little audience participation. How many folks here are interested in information on utility-scale wind projects? Okay, and then that suggests, but let me ask the question anyway, how many of you are interested in either what I would call community scale or even individual small turbines? And that's actually most of the folks here. Okay. On the other hand, well, that's good, and I expected that kind of response from this particular audience. On the other hand, I think you ought to realize that the small wind and advances in small wind turbine technology and so forth will tend to track what's going on in the utility scale projects, because it's the utility scale guys that have the big money to spend on system improvements, which will eventually work their way into the smaller wind systems. And incidentally, while I'm on that subject, the difference between the two, I was quite surprised to find out at the annual American Wind Energy Conference that none of the small wind turbine manufacturers that I'm familiar with and that are, let's say, long-term players in the market were represented at that American Wind Energy Association conference. And I did ask one gentleman why he thought that was the case, and it was apparently because the small wind turbine folks see more customers if they go to different kinds of conferences. Specifically, they were telling me the telecommunications industry happens to be one of their largest customers, and so they tend to go to those conferences and exhibit rather than at the annual American Wind Energy Association conference. An interesting insight, I think. So, as I mentioned before, this market report that this presentation summarizes is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, the Wind and Water Power Program in particular, and it's expected to be available in mid-July. The report will contain installation trends, industry trends, cost, performance, and price trends, which you'll find, I think, interesting this year. And of course, a summary of the policy and market drivers, which you've already heard a lot about, I think, from John Miles earlier today, and a future outlook. Here's a slide on the new wind capacity for 2011. You saw kind of a preview of this in John's slide just a few minutes ago. The up and downs actually track very closely with passage of the federal production tax credit for wind energy. As you can see, 2009 was a big year. The reason for the drop in 2010 is the expiration of a production tax credit. Approval of a 3-year program leads to the increase in 2011, and if 2012 is on this chart, you'd see that it's right up there again with maybe 2009, maybe a little bit less. And then the cumulative capacity is shown on the right-hand scale, and of course that's been growing as the new installations take place. I think the takeaway lesson from this slide and the one that John shows you is that what we are doing with our federal production tax credit is in no way to stimulate an industry or an economy. It's a very bad plan. What happens is these little bursts of production tax credits are too short to encourage anybody, I used to say anybody, but to encourage many industry players from building new manufacturing facilities in the United States. The prospect for long-term incentives in other countries are much better than they are here, so most of the production winds up being in other countries. Nevertheless, there's been a great deal of production capacity that did move to the United States during this period of time, but not nearly as much as I would expect if we had a consistent federal policy. And while I'm on that subject, I might as well mention that one of the problems I find over the years as I talk to folks about renewable energy is that there's a tendency for renewable energy people to say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with politics. I just want to, I just want to live off the grid or live using renewable energy and not interact with legislators or not have any interactions with politics. And the reality is, as John mentioned, all forms of energy receive some form of government support, public policy support, we call it. The solar industry recently received a multi-year production tax credit, which the wind industry has not received. And the nuclear industry gets a production tax credit as well for the next 10 new nuclear generators that are installed. So, and those tax credits for the nuclear industry amount to over $1 billion typically per reactor. So that's a very big deal. Right up here, okay. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that, and hope it gets better. All right, so with that being said, if you think you're going to participate particularly in the utility scale wind industry without production tax credits or without being on an equal footing, frankly, financial footing with the other energy sources, that's really an inaccurate perception. It's just not going to happen. And you'll see some of that later as you notice that the prices that a utility scale project receives for its electricity are tied, a utility scale wind project receives are tied directly to competing sources of energy. So wind is a major, here it is, for example, wind is a major source of new capacity. 33% of the new capacity for electricity installed in the United States in 2011 was from utility scale wind projects, and that is second only to natural gas. And I think most of you have probably heard about shale gas coming online in recent years in a big way, and that's driving down natural gas prices, which in turn drives down electricity prices, which in turn affects whether the wind industry is going to be profitable or not in any given year. Yeah, you see the percentage of wind as a percentage of the total installed capacity is shown there in that green line with the little circles. You'll see most of the new capacity is blue, which is natural gas, and there's a small amount of new coal that's been coming online in recent years, but most coal plants are actually, there's a net loss in coal production, coal-fired electricity production in the United States as a result of older plants being retired, A, because of their cost of generating electricity is going up, and secondly, that they need to be heavily modified in order to meet clean air standards. And when the owners of those facilities take a look at what it's going to cost to upgrade them, they choose to retire them in many cases. Most of those retirements, though, do happen to tend to be the smaller coal plants. New coal plants tend to be much larger than the ones that they're replacing. Let's talk about interconnection queues. Basically, this is a list that you need to get on if you want your project to be connected to the transmission system in order to get access to your markets. It takes a long time typically to build transmission to a new wind project if it doesn't already have one, or even to study the transmission system to make sure that it can take, let's say 100 megawatts or so, whatever the size of your wind project is, additional capacity on that particular line. If you get out into the rural areas, it doesn't take 100 megawatts to cause the utility company to ask for a delay in your project while it studies its transmission or even its distribution system. It may actually only take 10 or 20 megawatts to cause a problem. So the interconnection queues, which is this list, waiting list that you have to get on to connect to the local utility, suggests that both wind and gas will continue to dominate. Basically, you can look at those lists several years in advance and see who has asked for permission to interconnect. The utility is obligated by law to study each interconnection request in the order in which it was received. They can't do anything to bump somebody up. That's considered anti-competitive. And another thing to note, if you're not aware of it, about interconnection queues, is that people do get on the list and then for various reasons, maybe economic, maybe other reasons, ultimately don't build their proposed project. And so not all of the capacity that is on an interconnection queue will necessarily be built. It will, however, slow you down in terms of being able to go into production right away. And with a wind facility, that's pretty important because you can install a wind facility relatively quickly compared to, say, building a new coal-fired power plant or something. So if you're on a 3-year queue and you only have a 1-year construction cycle, you can see it gets a little strange, but you do have to get in the queue well in advance of your construction in order to be able to bring your system online when you anticipate, or at least as quickly as possible. And it does show you in the middle of this chart that there's 1.5 times as much wind power in the queue as the next largest resource, which is natural gas. However, as it mentioned, since not all of it will be built, in particular, chances are very good that there's a lot of wind energy facilities that will not be built that were projected that are in the queue. And that's because of the expiration of the production tax credit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to some other slides. This is just a slide that points out what I just hinted at in the previous slide, which is that wind developers tend to be optimistic with respect to how many projects they're planning to build versus how many actually get built, and that has everything to do with what I told you about how long that interconnection queue is. And you don't just get in that queue and wait. You have to pay the local utility to study the transmission line, and that's not cheap. That's typically hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size. Could at least tens of thousands, and usually hundreds of thousands of dollars for the utility company to study the transmission system to tell you whether you'll be able to interconnect with their system or not. And most often, it's to tell you at what cost you'll be able to interconnect. Cost in expansion of their facilities, addition of additional transformers or actual transmission lines out to your facility. And the point of this chart was to say that various industry folks who study the industry analysts, either at the Energy Information Administration, Bloomberg, Navigant, and a few other places, have slightly different estimates on what the to-be-built capacity will actually be based on the assumptions regarding the production tax credit, whether there will be an extension or not an extension. And since I have that chart up there, this may be a good time to talk about the likelihood. Did anyone talk about that likelihood of an extension yet? Okay, then since that's rather critical to the industry, let me talk about that. It turns out that there is actually widespread bipartisan support in Congress for an extension of the production tax credit. And there's also widespread grassroots support for renewable energy of various sources, particularly solar and wind. And of the two, it's just more likely because of the cost and the scale of things that wind energy would dominate solar in any economically based expansion of the renewable energy generated electricity in America. So that being said, you might wonder why the production tax credit hasn't been extended, let's say, at the beginning of this year rather than late in this year or early next year or even late next year. And the Congress has, in fact, passed production tax credits retroactively, which probably makes them feel good, but doesn't do a whole lot for the industry, because if you haven't built your project already, if you do build a project without the production tax credit, it's probably a financial gamble, and there aren't too many lenders who are willing to support you in that. And so, you know, it doesn't do much to stimulate new generation. It just simply helps those folks who went ahead and took the gamble to break even, basically. But that being said, the reason we haven't seen a production tax credit, one of the main reasons, at least as it's been stated, is that you know, the Republican Party does not want to give President Obama a renewable energy victory prior to the election. So, you know, that's not to be a partisan statement. I'm just making that as take that as a sort of a neutral statement, because I don't want to say anything that steps on any Republican toes, since we need allies in both parties. But that being the case, I mean, you can think about it, and that makes perfect sense. Why, you know, why give during election year? Why give your opponent an advantage that he doesn't, that you'd rather not, or that you don't feel obligated to give him? That being said, the conventional wisdom is that a production tax credit may very well pass during the lame duck session after the presidential elections in November. The only problem with that theory is that actually there are about 101 various different tax credits that are not passing prior to the election, which would have to be debated, you know, between November and December and early January, debated and passed. And of course, Congress wants to take a holiday break around the beginning of the year. So the likelihood of all 100 of those tax credit extensions being passed simultaneously along with the production tax credit for wind is pretty slim. So the issue is going to become one of time constraints and priorities. You know, what exactly can the lame duck, what exactly will the lame duck Congress perceive to be its priorities for the end of the year? And will it be this bipartisan supported production tax credit? Or will one of those priorities be? Not likely. Well, I shouldn't say not likely. You know, obviously the industry would like to believe that. It's just that when you look at the math and you say, wait a minute, there's going to be 101 different industry sectors down there lobbying the Congress people that we have, trying to get their favorite tax credit passed, and so it's a kind of iffy. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it won't get passed in the following year in 2013. And again, I would say its chances of passage are even much better in 2013 than the lame duck session, but that really makes it difficult to do any planning. And I think from an industry perspective, what happens is most of these countries that develop utility scale wind projects, most of these companies are international companies, so they work anywhere in the world that they choose to, and they have limited staff and a limited ability to focus on any one project or another. So if they're looking at a year like this year where the federal production tax credit expires on December 31st, they're not looking to build projects in the United States in 2013, which may or may not be economically viable. They start looking in other countries and send their staff to go develop projects in other countries for 2013. So even if the production tax credit passes in late 2012 or early 2013, most likely you won't see a big increase or a recovery, if you will, in the amount of installed wind capacity in the United States until 2014. So we need at least a 2-year production tax credit extension, and that's probably the minimum at this point in history. At least we need at least a 2-year extension. And so I think the takeaway lesson from that is, if you have an interest in wind generation, you need to be talking to your congressperson or your candidate if you're looking for to replace the incumbent, and make sure you get a pledge out of them to support the production tax credit at the earliest possible moment, with either if they are incumbents or when they take office if they're newly elected. And this is just another chart that shows what folks expect the installed capacity to be, the number of gigawatts of new wind based on various scenarios with or without the production tax extension. You can see that 2012, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference between the amount of installations that would take place with no extension versus an extension. And that's because, as I told you, the folks that do these projects typically start looking somewhere else by this time of the year if they don't see a production tax credit on the horizon for 2013. And so then, so you see the nosedive that takes place almost down to zero in some cases for the amount of new wind to be installed in 2013, and then a recovery in 2014, but only really if the production tax credit is extended. And so as you can see, if there were a third year to that extension, hopefully the 2015 number might get up there around the 2012 number. As it says in that bullet down at the bottom, whether or not the production tax credit is extended to 2013 is likely to be a lost year. So globally, this was a great year. The U.S. is second only to China in both new and cumulative capacity, and that's something of a record, moving ahead of some of the other companies, particularly Germany, in terms of cumulative capacity. And I believe I was told in 2012, U.S. is actually ahead of China in new installed wind capacity, which is pretty remarkable. Question over here.
Yes, the last slide, it sounds like you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that in order to help wind, the tax credits need to be longer than the queue length. Is that correct?
It takes at least, let me repeat that question again for the recording. The question is, it looks like in order to be effective, a production tax credit has to be at least a 2-year tax credit. Okay. Okay, so that's the essence of the question, I think. And then the question is, does it need to be a 3-year? At the very minimum, it needs to be a 2-year production tax credit based on the numbers that you've seen in this chart and some previous ones that I've shown, as well as John Miles has shown. You see almost no activity or relatively little activity in the first year of a 2-year extension, and then a big jump in the second year. And that's because once it's passed, it takes some time for people to actually do project planning and get permits and so forth, and then it takes about another year for the construction. So the bare minimum is 2 years. But if you wait until the very last year, or the very last month, or nearly the very last month of the year in which it's going to expire, or you actually let it expire and then pass the thing retroactively, that's what this bullet here, the second to the last bullet, is trying to say. The year, if you pass it like 60 days before the beginning of the year, or even well into the new year, that's a lost year. You're not going to get very much installed capacity that year. So that's why if you wait until the end of the, it's about to expire, or you let it expire, then you really do need a 3-year extension. And so that's the other aspect that you need to lobby for, is at least a 3-year extension. But frankly, go for broke here. Push for a 10-year extension or something like that, which is what the solar, I don't know if it's 10 or 15, the solar people got, and the nuclear people have had for a number of years. Hope that answered your question. Okay, so as I mentioned here, the U.S., as I understood it, or as I heard the presentation when this was given at AWEA for 2012, the U.S. actually exceeded China in terms of new annual capacity. But that is not going to, of course, be the case in 2013. And this is a real busy chart, but what they're trying to tell you, here's what the headline says, basically, is that wind capacity at the end of 2011 equates to about 3.4% of U.S. electricity consumption. If you remember, Professor Miles was talking to you about the plans for 20% by 2020. With the production tax credit history and forecasts that we're looking at, that's a real tall order to hit 20% by 2020. And this is a slide that's designed to show you who the big market players are. GE is now tied with Vestas for the top U.S. market share in 2011. And again, it's a busy chart with a lot of information on it. It's not the sort of thing we want to dwell on too much in a presentation like this, but you can see the green area at the bottom is worth noting. That's GE Wind. The yellow is Vestas. And then if you're looking all the way over on the right-hand side, 2011, the green is approximately equal to the yellow, which was what the headline was trying to tell you. Now, one of the interesting things is, although the number of original equipment manufacturers, I'm looking at the second to the last bullet here, the number of original equipment manufacturers serving the U.S. has increased. The big three, GE, Vestas, and Siemens, have actually gained market share since 2008 and 2009, and that's attributed to the fact that the economy took a nosedive, and typically in 2008, as we're all aware, and typically when that happens, the large companies survive, the small ones tend to get bought up or fail. Occasionally a large one will fail, but certainly more small ones fail than large ones. So that reflects a focus on not only bankable turbines, but also bankable companies that grew out of the 2008 financial crisis. So a little market consolidation going on in bad economic times, which is fairly normal. This is a reference, turbine scaling is experiencing a second leg up. This is a reference to the fact that in a lot of cases, they're getting more production out of a given turbine, but not because they've done anything to what's inside the nacelle as much as they are now building longer blades to fit on the same nacelle and the same tower. And that's allowing the turbines to start up at lower wind speeds, allowing them to become cost competitive in wind zones that they weren't previously cost competitive in, basically class 3 wind zones. And you'll see a couple of slides that highlight that point or make that point in different ways. This bullet, for example, shows you 42% of the turbines installed in 2011 were greater than 2 megawatts, which is up from only 28% of those turbines in 2010. Then typically you get the 2 megawatt turbine by taking something like a 1.5 or a 1.6 turbine and making the rotor a little bit longer. And as it says on that last bullet, the recent spurt in rotor scaling reflects a proliferation of low wind speed designs. What they're showing you with the triangles and the dots in that chart is that the average hub height, you'll see, is not really increased a whole lot. It's increased a little bit, but not a whole lot between 2010 and 2011. But the average rotor diameter took a bit of a, well, it's continuing a trend that it began roughly in 2009. You'll see a strong upward trend, or even in 2008, an upward trend in rotor length, rotor diameter, which is blade length, twice, to be accurate. Domestic manufacturing increased in 2011. That is probably more than anything else directly attributable to the production tax credit and to a certain amount of confidence that it would be renewed, even if it's allowed to expire periodically. Not sure how long the industry is going to tolerate that kind of risk when it can go to other countries and find more consistent manufacturing policies or more consistent wind energy policies, which make it financially reasonable to consider building manufacturing facilities there. They do note that the U.S. now has almost 14 gigawatts of nacelle assembly capacity, which is pretty good, roughly equal to what we installed, frankly, in 2012. But 2012 may end up utilizing much of that, but 2013 is likely to cause severe pain, meaning a lot of that capacity is going to go idle. We have a question here? Nacelle is the box, basically, that the gears and the generator are located in, on which the rotor is attached. The box at the top of the tower. A big box, in some cases 2 stories tall and maybe half the size of this room. Okay. Sorry about that. And it mentions a growing percentage of turbine equipment. And I say turbine, and that's because when I was in the Air Force, that's what we called a turbine. But I noticed that a lot of folks in the American Wind Energy Conference are using the word turbine. And I think part of that has to do with which part of the country you come in, and then in my case, whether your background was in aircraft, where it's always been a turbine engine that I can recall, or you're in the wind industry. And what I actually heard, believe it or not, was in that terms of that pronunciation is that since turbine sounds very much like turban, the headdress, there are a lot of folks that don't want to use turbine. They want to say turbine. But at any rate, a growing percentage of turbine or turbine equipment used in U.S. projects has been sourced domestically, roughly 70% in 2011, which is very good compared to what had been previously. As you can see, only about half of that equipment came from U.S. manufacturers in 2005 and 2006. That's a very, very big deal from a political point of view and a very strong selling point if you're trying to encourage your legislators to support a production tax credit or other policies that are favorable to wind energy development. The parts are starting to be made more, most of the equipment is made in the U.S. is the takeaway point. Yes, sir.
The production tax credit is on the production of electricity.
That's correct. The production tax credit is on the production of electricity.
So that sort of secondarily affects the production of the manufacture of equipment.
Right. There are direct. The question was, or the comment was, that indirectly affects the profitability of a wind project, and yes, it does. One way or another, you have to make your money, or show the banks and the lenders that you're going to make some money if you build a wind project. And there's various ways you can get it, various tax credits. The production tax credit's been the most important one for the wind industry for the past few years, and as the charts indicated, and so that's why we continue to talk about it. But yes, it's an indirect incentive based, and it's probably the better of the two. There are such things as investment tax credits. You spend X number of dollars to build the facility, you can get some money back from the federal government for that, a substantial amount of money. But from a public policy point of view, you'd rather see the electricity produced, not the money spent. In other words, you don't really care how much money the developer spends on the project. You really want to see some electricity produced. So production tax credit is, in my opinion, a slightly better public policy than an investment tax credit, because it guarantees there'll be some renewable electricity produced in this case. So here you have a chart that shows you that wind turbine prices have softened since 2008, and that has everything to do with the declining economy. That also makes utility scale and even small wind generation more profitable. Not much, I don't want to focus too much on that, just show you that little wave there in 2008 and 2009. There was a peak, and now we're starting to see prices drop off. We might even see some additional continuation of that price drop off if the production tax credit is not renewed very quickly, because we'll have all this idle turbine manufacturing capacity in the United States, basically. And lower turbine pricing has been slow to influence reported installed project costs. Various reasons for that. A lot of these contracts may be locked in a year or two in advance in terms of price, and then it becomes hard to get out of them. So you have to build your project based on last year's prices, and this year's prices are lower, but if you default, you'll never get to talk to that turbine manufacturer again, so you go ahead and pay the higher price for your turbines, that sort of thing. And this is turbine scaling reference to the larger diameter rotors that are becoming more common. Should boost performance, but it is offset by declining resource quality, the reference there being to the fact that if you're a wind developer and you're looking for a wind project in a given region, you go look for the best wind resource. And those projects tend to get built first, and then the folks who come along later have to look at lower mountains or parts of the prairie that aren't quite as windy, and so that's the reference to the declining resource quality. The wind speeds just aren't as fast in the undeveloped areas as they are in the currently developed areas. But the fact that they now have or are designing rotors that can perform at start up at lower wind speeds is helping to increase the amount of electricity coming from a given capacity wind project facility. And that's what the blue line is showing you. The rotor diameter is going up, and the hub height, we saw that before, is remaining it's not going up as fast. It's going up a little bit, but not as fast. And the hub height is a reference, again, to the center of that turbine, the thing that the blades are attached to, which is also the center, typically the center of the nacelle at the top of the tower. Towers are getting taller, blades are getting longer, which makes for more electricity production and for a given wind speed, or higher wind speeds because you put the turbine up higher. And then there's a reference here to curtailment. Two reasons for curtailment. That's a reference to when you're forced for some reason to shut down your wind facility, even though you have wind blowing. And the two reasons tend to be wildlife, birds and bats, coming close to your facility, and you have some agreement or I feel a moral obligation to shut down during the passage of birds and bats. And then the other form is an economic form where you're in an electricity market where they charge you for producing electricity if there's a surplus of electricity on the grid. That typically happens in the fall and in the spring when there are not big demands on electricity from air conditioning, either air conditioning or heating. And all the nuclear power plants don't want to shut down because it takes too long to get them going again. And all the coal-fired power plants don't want to shut down and it takes too long to get them going again. And so, and all the wind power plants want to keep running. You wind up with a surplus of electricity. In order to get rid of that surplus, you have to do what the electricity industry calls heat a lake. Basically, you have to heat some water somewhere. It might be a river, it might be a lake, blow some steam out of a nuclear power plant. But the point is it costs money. If everybody wants to continue producing, nobody wants to throttle back when consumers aren't really using much electricity. And so the electricity markets tend to charge a fee if you remain online when they don't need you. And then that results in those people who can shut down will shut down. It's cheaper to shut off a wind turbine and start it up again than it is to throttle back a nuclear or coal-fired power plant. So the wind industry tends to curtail a little bit quicker than the coal industry or on the nuclear industry when there's an excess of production. There's a illustration down there at the last bullet, 2011 curtailment within these 6 geographic areas that are shown here equals the annual output of roughly 1,200 megawatts of wind power, assuming a 33% capacity factor. So that's a pretty big curtailment. One would expect that to go down a little bit as natural gas assumes a responsibility for a larger production, larger proportion of the production of electricity in the country, and that's because it's relatively easy to cut back a natural gas generator and then start it up again on short notice. And since natural gas is a fuel and has some positive cost where the wind energy doesn't, it's more likely that a natural gas plant will throttle back and allow a wind project to continue running. So I guess one of the points not made on this slide but mentioned in the conference more than once is as the electricity market moves towards more natural gas production, that's actually a favorable outcome for the wind energy industry, other than not having any natural gas at all and letting it all go to expensive coal or nuclear generation. So despite the fact that there have been some curtailments, the fleet-wide average capacity factor has generally increased over time. That's the proportion of time when your generator is actually producing electricity. And the main reason for that happens to be, as I told you before, the lower cut-in speeds due to the longer blade length and taller towers. And I'm looking at the time. I don't want to run too late, and we are near the end of these slides. The power purchase agreement is how much you get paid for your electricity, and I think we alluded to this in another slide. As cheap natural gas comes online and as the economy goes through this difficult time, you'll see there was a peak in 2008 and 2009 for the price that you receive for your wind energy, and it's falling off in 2011 and 2012. Prices are higher outside of the wind belt. Now that makes some sense. Wind belt, cheap wind energy, lower prices paid. Outside of that, you get higher prices paid if you can find a windy place to build your wind project. And of course, prices in California are particularly high, and I think the most important point on that chart, in the green is the bubbles are the California bubbles. California is not always an outlier, but it revised its renewable portfolio standard, and that's triggered higher prices for wind energy in California, the highest in the country, basically. And that's what this chart tells you. And the little red crosses in there are a price that California uses to determine what it's going to pay you for your wind energy based on its value in the renewable energy market in California. It's called the market price reference. And this just shows you the green area is various estimates of what natural gas prices are going to be. And the average wind power purchase agreement price is a solid blue line running right through there. So it's at the bottom end of what natural gas prices are expected to be. And conclusions, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I'll let you read that slide. I won't try to read it to you. The point there again is that we had a really good year in 2011 and 2012, and it's going to be a really sad year for the wind industry in 2013. And that's all I have. Any questions there? We have one here.
Yeah, I actually got two questions, two separate questions. I noticed there's no mention of a feed-in tariff here, and I'll qualify that. I'm a grad student here. I'm doing my thesis on financing renewables and public policy. And about up to my eyeballs of it. I find myself favoring feed-in tariffs because one is tax-based, one is consumer-based. So it's a lot easier. You don't have to pass anything. Also, the renewable portfolio standards coming from the states are taking the shape of feed-in tariffs. And as you said before, very little is going to get through Congress. But the states, particularly California, are taking over the momentum. And they're adding more resources and stuff like that. So I want to see, why is the feed-in tariff been eliminated or left out of this presentation?
Okay, two-part question, or two questions, or let's take the first one, which is why didn't I talk about a feed-in tariff, basically. Feed-in tariffs are widely used in other countries, successfully widely used in other countries to stimulate the wind energy market or the renewable energy market in general, including wind energy. And they are not, it's not a federal policy, never has been a federal policy in the United States to have a feed-in tariff. Some states and some regions have approved local or statewide or regional feed-in tariffs, but it's typically for small wind and small solar projects and small projects of various kinds, not for utility scale projects. And the emphasis here, for whatever reason on this presentation, was on utility scale. The one region that I know of that has such a feed-in tariff is TVA, and that covers multiple states, mostly Tennessee, of course, but and that's limited in size. So last I heard, and it may have changed, but last I heard, the largest wind turbine you could build there was a 50 kilowatt, not megawatt, 50 kilowatt single tower system to receive their feed-in tariff. I know North Carolina has a feed-in tariff for solar. I think it may have it for small wind. I know it has it for something you can do with poultry litter or poultry waste and hog waste. But again, it's not usually for large-scale facilities. I will say, because you asked the question, Dominion Virginia Power currently has an application pending before Virginia State Corporation Commission for approval of a feed-in tariff for solar systems only. It's part of what they call their community solar program. Prior to that application being filed with the State Corporation Commission, feed-in tariff was a four-letter word among the utility industry and among the legislature in Virginia. It is something they didn't want to do. Your point is well taken. A tax goes directly to the taxpayers. A production tax credit affects taxpayers directly. A feed-in tariff affects them indirectly, but in the eyes of the Virginia General Assembly, at any rate, there's very little difference in their mind between a feed-in tariff and a production tax credit or some sort of other public policy benefit to wind energy, because in many cases those who are electricity ratepayers are the same people who are also state taxpayers.
We have a perfect model in the success of Germany.
Yeah, there's perfect models internationally, but our government has elected not to do that, and I don't know what to tell you other than the fact that it's frequently discussed. The industry typically thinks a feed-in tariff is a better way to go, but legislators have never shown much appetite, or most legislators have never shown much appetite for a feed-in tariff.
Yeah, there was a minor attempt made by Jay Inslee, and nothing ever came of it.
Okay, let me go to your second question, which was renewable portfolio standard, and I guess I'll have to ask you at this point to repeat the question because I've now forgotten.
All right, the second question, all right, there's a rather heated debate going on LinkedIn right now on the quality of the turbines. Some saying they're very inferior, they're putting in less expensive parts, the longevity of the things are in question. Second part of that, do you know of a certifying agency that can, you say, like you have electrical standards. Is there anything with wind where we would know what the quality of the turbine was?
I can say with confidence that for small wind turbines, that the answer is yes. For larger wind turbines, I'm not so sure. I think to some extent it's buyer beware. For the utility scale wind turbines, I don't think it's as much a problem because each manufacturer winds up accumulating a performance record over a period of time. It's always a problem with a new manufacturer who comes online or brings new turbines to the market, and you're not sure how well they're going to perform. But it doesn't take very long before they begin accumulating a performance record. And that record you can demand if you're a buyer of those large turbines. For the small wind turbines, the American Wind Energy Association has actually passed performance test protocols. They're not saying that your small wind turbine has to meet a certain performance standard per se, but it has to be tested according to a certain protocol, and if it's tested towards according to that protocol, then whatever the output is of that turbine, that's what you're allowed to advertise if you claim that you have a certified turbine result. And so that's a relatively new development over the last couple of years. We had just only passed that test protocol within the last couple of years, and some independent test organizations have now been formed in order to actually perform those tests, or to monitor those tests if the manufacturer is performing them themselves. So that there's only 2 or 3 brands and models within the brands that are currently certified, but there may be half a dozen or more that are currently in testing. So you're in a lot better shape with the small wind turbines than you used to be in terms of, is the number that the manufacturer advertising for the capacity of that turbine under standard test conditions a realistic number? Much better off than you were before. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for your time.